Hello, this is a summary of EWT, and for more information beyond this presentation, please visit the URL that you see there at the bottom of this page. In this summary, we'll discuss three things: the simplicity of the theory, it'll summarize the proof, and it'll logically explain everything from particles to atoms and molecules. But we'll start first with simple. Because it really is a simple universe, and a three-dimensional one at that, obeying one set of physical laws, right? Not hidden dimensions, not two sets of laws, one for the smallest of particles and another one for large objects, just one set of physical laws. Now, the fabric of space, it consists of two fundamental components. One is going to be something called the granule that transfers energy, and one reflects that, called the wave center. It looks something like this, which might have an equivalent like water molecules bouncing and creating water waves, or air molecules creating sound waves. Something exists to create waves, and it's really just a transfer of energy following the conservation of energy principle. Now, all of motion and particle creation is a result of this rule, which is just wave centers minimizing wave amplitude. And the energy, the simplicity of the math, is all wrapped up into that one equation based on wave parameters in a given volume, V. That's it for the simplicity of the rules and the math. Now, is it provable? EWT follows a scientific method, which is building equations that can model the behavior of particles, of photons and forces, and comparing it to observations from past experiments. And you see some of the lists here of particle energies and orbital distances and electron ionization energies, all as examples. There's much more. But it should also be able to predict future experiments. Now, many of these experiments are rather difficult. A lot of it is high energy experiments, or some are based in neutrino experiments. And you see the list here. Now, perhaps the one that might come first is the third one there, which we've illustrated here in that diagram, is 5 quarks. Now, as the energy is increased in particle collision experiments, the proton is likely to be the pentaquark, which already has been discovered, but likely to see a lot more high energy collisions result in pentaquarks for the proton. Okay, so now let's walk through the logic of the theory. And it's logical because nature repeats itself. Here's a formation of atoms forming molecules, and look at the formations from linear to triangular and tetrahedral patterns. We'll start first with that H2O molecule there at the top right, because vibration of water molecules creates water waves. We see the same thing with air molecules too. Vibration of those molecules creates sound waves. So here we see particles creating waves all the time through their vibration. And so therefore it's logical to assume that even the smallest components that make up those molecules do the same thing. And here you can see the formation of granules moving as waves, and those 4 properties in a given volume is an energy equation. But we view that energy in different ways, right? We know it as particles, which are the energy of standing longitudinal waves. We know it as photons, which is the energy of transverse waves, and much more, as will be described. But first, particles. Particles are created from longitudinal standing waves, that energy of the granules bouncing around, which is very hard to visualize, so it will be represented as sine waves there in the future, you see in the bottom right. But this is a particle, standing waves of energy. And that standing wave, by the way, is created from an in wave reflected from that wave center, creating an out wave, and this combination of those two waves merged together that becomes the standing wave. Now, all of motion can be simplified to this rule. It's a motion to minimize wave amplitude. It's going to be the cause of all particle creation and forces. And so that wave center there, just with the yellowish icon, just means that the symbol here is that it's not minimizing wave amplitude until the point that it does, and it then stops and it's stable. Now within standing waves, the point of minimal amplitude is the node. It creates a stable position for a particle because the fundamental rule is minimizing wave amplitude, and there at the node it is. And what's important about standing waves are there are two nodes for each wavelength, and they're at opposite wave phase, and so it creates two different types of particles, particle and its antiparticle, primarily because of wave phase, causing either constructive or destructive wave interference. Now, when wave centers combine at standing wave nodes, this was what it would look like in more of a two-dimensional view because these are spherical waves, and you can see the intersection where those nodes might be. You can start to see why triangular patterns, or in the case of three-dimensional, it would be a tetrahedron, but tetrahedral patterns or formations for stability because of the intersection where standing wave nodes would exist. And as you combine wave centers together, wave amplitude increases. There's more being reflected and amplitude increases proportional to the number of wave centers. And so does the particle radius because it's the number of wavelengths of standing waves. And it increases as well proportional to the number of wave centers until it becomes traveling waves. And everything within that sphere of standing waves is measured as particles' rest energy. It's really just standing longitudinal waves of energy. There's energy there, but a standing wave is essentially stored energy. There's no net propagation of energy in a standing wave. So that's what makes it different from a traveling wave. Now, in nature, we see particle creation known as neutrino oscillation. As neutrinos come from the sun, they might merge, for example, let's say create a muon neutrino, and that process of neutrinos gaining in mass is called neutrino oscillation, and here's why. It's just wave centers with enough energy to be able to merge and create a new particle. And in particle accelerator experiments that have much higher energy levels, you can form even heavier particles where you merge even more wave centers together. But as you add more and more wave centers in these complex geometries, a wave center that's not on the node of a standing wave is going to have a force. Right? That's the one rule, which is to minimize its wave amplitude. And it's going to cause particle decay until it reaches the point where it has wave centers that are stable. Now, the electron is very stable. Right? So what makes it different? And in EWT, the electron is calculated to have 10 wave centers, which happens to be a 3-level tetrahedron. And in most directions where waves are, because of the geometry of this, it's going to be stable. And although the particle is mostly stable, there are going to be some wave centers in some direction where waves are where there will be motion. But rather than decay and break apart, it's still held mostly intact, and that motion causes this, it causes spin. And each one of those wave centers is doing individual spin, and it's creating a new type of wave. That spin wave becomes a transverse wave, and that's what we see as magnetism. Now the electron is going to get smaller as I progress here, so it's just given a different icon now that you see there, but that's the electron. Now forces. The electric force is motion of particles reacting to wave interference. Two particles that exist on the same wave phase of this standing wave nodes have constructive interference between them, and so therefore by the rule, to minimize wave amplitude, they separate until the amplitude is minimized. Particles of opposite phase on the standing wave nodes are destructive between them, causing wave amplitude to be lower between those two particles, and they then are attracted to each other. What's red is the positron. And the magnetic force is very similar. Right? It has constructive and destructive wave interference just like the electric force, but whereas the electric force is longitudinal waves, here we have transverse waves that are constructive for same spin electrons. So the direction of motion, since it's increased in between those two particles, is to minimize it and force it away. And the same thing for destructive wave interference for electrons of opposite spin is destructive in between those two particles. So in the absence of any other force, and that's the key here, so there will be other forces like the electric force, those two particles will be attracted because of destructive wave interference from the transverse waves. And the gravitational force. Right, there's wave centers, as it was described, that are spinning to be able to create that transverse wave, known as magnetism. That takes energy. And due to the conservation of energy, that longitudinal outwave is decreased in energy, or wave amplitude, just slightly, and very, very slightly. Now for a single particle, because it is so slight, with an atom, which is now electrically neutral and not repelling it, that electron would be attracted, but it is so slight and it's not noticeable. Now, it's not noticeable until you have a collection of a number of different atoms, because it's a cumulative effect on the decrease in that amplitude. And so in a large body that consists of many, many atoms, we see that effect as gravity. Next, the strong force. Now, two electrons are normally repelled due to constructive wave interference, but if they have enough energy, just like particles, because wave centers are create particles by forming at standing wave nodes. The same thing can happen for particles. They can appear as standing wave nodes, but it takes a tremendous amount of energy for a particle like the electron to get there. But when it does, it can be stable. And it transfers that energy, now has an increased amplitude in that transverse wave, which we know as a gluon. And furthermore, because it takes so much energy now to spin, very little longitudinal waves emerge, and that electron really doesn't appear like an electron, and now appears to be a new particle, such as a quark, and it's formed a composite particle. But also, just like particles, it takes wave centers and particles in geometries that are stable in three-dimensional waves, and again, it's a tetrahedron. So here's four quarks forming the empty nucleon. So what's a proton? Now, that empty nucleon can attract a positron, and that is the pentaquark of the proton that was found and validated at CERN in 2015. Four quarks and an antiquark, otherwise known as four electrons in this theory that no longer appear like electrons, appear like quarks, and the positron is the antiquark. That's the pentaquark. So it's a neutron. Neutron would be another electron attracted to the center. That now essentially annihilates its destructive wave interference with that middle positron, so it no longer has a charge. Now all this can be validated quite easily with the weak force. The weak force is, so say a solar neutrino has enough energy to be able to eject that center electron, and it transforms that neutron to be a proton. And this is exactly what's seen in beta decay results. Neutron becomes a proton and ejects an electron and a neutrino, not quarks. Now an orbital force, brand new. For this, because something has to keep the electron in an orbit. So in the pentaquark structure of the proton, the electron is attracted to that middle positron, but yet it is repelled by an orbital force. It's a wave passing through two or more of those quarks in alignment. And it's only repelled in this alignment, which is why the electron has a probable location. Now, photons, when that electron is attracted to a proton, a photon can be emitted, and if you look at the change in energy there, it's destructive wave interference. That change in energy is exactly equal to the new transverse wave energy. So it's been shown in EWT that all photon creation and absorption is simply a conservation of energy, just transferring between the two wave types, longitudinal to transverse or vice versa. Shrink that down a little bit more, and now that proton is given a red sphere icon instead, and a little up arrow means a spin up proton. So here is hydrogen, but the orbitals can be explained by same spin protons. So here's helium now, add a spin down proton, but when we get to lithium, now it's adding a third proton, so you have two spin up protons in alignment, and during that alignment of its quarks, the repelling force pushes it out even further. Still always attracted, but it's repelled out now on that axis of alignment for 2 spin-up protons. You add another one, you have the second 2s electron. But now, beginning with boron, it starts to form a three-dimensional structure, and now you have at least 3 protons in alignment, 2 of which might have the same spin and 1 of opposite spin. And as the nucleus is spinning, and all the protons are spinning with it, there creates times during that alignment where you might have all 3 protons aligned, even if it's very briefly along this axis, where it forces an electron out further, and that creates the strange shape of the p orbital, which looks like a sphere but maybe cut in half. It becomes dumbbells. And that's because of just the alignment of same spin protons with an opposite spin proton at a particular rotation. And the same thing happens then with the d orbital, but you've added a 4th row now of the tetrahedron and also another additional axis of alignment, because there's now 4 protons in alignment. The same thing happens with the f orbital, where you add a 5th row of the tetrahedron, and again additional axes where the electron is pushed out, which causes the strange shapes of the f orbital. Now each one of those is a block in the periodic sequence. So the 3rd row, the 4th row, and the 5th row respectively become the p block, the d block, and the f block. And here is that sequence and the blocks that were mentioned. It's called the periodic table of elements. And the red ovals that overlay the periodic table of elements are the completion of a tetrahedral row, which will be explained. Let's start first with helium. Hydrogen and helium appear at the top of the table and are unique. That's really the last one to complete a 1D, a linear structure, before completing a 2-dimensional structure here with beryllium. And then with boron, it begins to build out a 3-dimensional structure, and it's building a tetrahedron because it finishes the 3rd level with 6 protons at neon. But it starts to build out symmetry for spherical waves first before building out the d orbital, but now you have the symmetry and a 4th level tetrahedron at 10 protons, the d orbital. And same thing again, it'll build out some symmetry for building out the 5th row of a tetrahedron, which is the f orbital, 15 protons. And so it explains the nucleus structure. The same rules that apply to particle creation apply to the formation of protons in the nucleus, and explain the periodic structure. And it continues, even beyond the formation of nuclei, even to molecules. You see a lot of the same patterns. Here's a carbon atom. If we layer on 4 hydrogen atoms that share those electrons, that's CH4. Right, another example of tetrahedral patterns. And so really everything that we see around us, if we were to summarize EWT, they're formed of molecules, formed from atoms, formed from particles like the proton, formed from particles like the electron. But really at the core of the electrons, it's a standing wave. So at the core is what's reflecting and creating those standing waves, which are these things. And all particles can be created from this, which is a fundamental particle called a wave center here, but very likely to be the neutrino. And not only can all the particles be created from a fundamental particle, but the rule for the creation of particles and for all forces is the single rule, to move in the direction of minimal wave amplitude. And although it's different for a traveling wave and a standing wave, you see here the standing wave, and the creation of particles is because the standing wave, the point of minimal wave amplitude, is the node. And so the logic here is that nature is very simple. And we can see molecules, but we can't see, and probably never will be able to see, the smallest of particles. But it is simply nature building upon itself from the smallest molecule, smallest particle, to building other particles like the electron, which was a tetrahedron, an electron building the proton, which is another 2-level tetrahedron, and protons building atomic nuclei, but again in the same geometric patterns for stability to the molecules that we can see, and we can recognize these same structures. So we can see, if we believe that nature is building upon itself using the same rule, which is to minimize wave amplitude. And that's the core, the simplicity, and the rules for energy wave theory, and I hope you have a wonderful day.